All right, welcome back to the second of the Good Life review videos. We'll be talking about hedonism in this video. Remember, our question is, what is the good life? On the screen there are a few alternative ways of putting the same question. We're coming off of our discussion of psychological egoism, which is a descriptive thesis or claim about our fundamental or ultimate desires and motivations as human beings. That claim, according to the hedonist, the idea is we are ultimately motivated only by our own self-interest. This raises the question of what is in a person's interests and what is against a person's interests. In other words, and this is basically another way of putting the question of the good life, what makes a person's life go better or worse? What harms a person and what benefits her in an ultimate sense? What is a well-lived human life? Hedonism is a kind of simple and, I would say, some might think a common sense answer to this question. Well, the question of the good life or self-interest, one might think, is pretty easy to answer. A life goes better to the extent that it's happier, right? Happiness is what we're all after. And what is happiness? Well, happiness is just feeling happy. So the most happy feelings you have, or the most pleasure you have, the better your life goes. And conversely, the more pain you have, or the most unhappiness, the more unhappiness you have, the worse your life is going. Slightly more precisely put, hedonism says that the good life is the life of maximal net pleasure. And net pleasure is just the total amount of pleasure or positive feelings or happiness felt across a life minus the total amount of pain felt across that life. What you want to do is max out your net pleasure number by the end of your life. We read an ancient hedonist. There are modern day hedonists as well. I think that Epicurus's hedonism is often neglected in discussions of hedonism. Often the figures that are discussed are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. But Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher, and a lot of his hedonistic philosophy you get in his letter. It's just a few pages long, but there's a lot packed in there. Here's what Epicurus says in the letter. And for this cause we call pleasure the beginning and end of the blessed life, or the good life. For we recognize pleasure as the first good innate in us. There you have a kind of statement of a specific kind of egoism. He's like, why think that pleasure is the beginning and end of the blessed or good life? Well, as a matter of descriptive fact, we all recognize pleasure as the first and fundamental, most desirable thing. Naturally, we want pleasure and we want to avoid pain. That's just how we're set up motivationally. And from pleasure, we begin every act of choice and avoidance. And to pleasure, we return again, using the feeling as a standard by which to judge every good. So not only do we, in fact, ultimately want pleasure, according to Epicurus, we also use the amount of pleasure that something can get us as a measurement of how good it is. How much I care about money is a function of how much pleasure I can get with the money. How much I care about and am motivated to, say, get a degree from University of Central Florida. Well, how many units of good feeling and what kinds of good feelings can that degree, so to speak, buy me in the future, in the form of a job, in the form of social connections, in the form of money, whatever the case may be, that ultimately gives rise to the positive feelings. You might be like, there's something to this idea. I think it's pretty simple and straightforward. The good life is the more pleasant one. That leaves the following question unanswered, though. how as a practical matter should I go about getting the most pleasure, right? Or the most net pleasure in particular? What kind of lifestyle should I be leading? I mean, there's really at least two, but broadly, two types of lifestyles that you could imagine a hedonist advancing as the most efficient way to get the most pleasure. One is the kind of profligate lifestyle. This is the word that Epicurus uses. The profligate lifestyle is one in which you just go about satisfying whatever desires are strongest, most immediate, and when fulfilled, give you the most pleasure, right? You briefly sit down and think, which desires feel the best to fulfill, the most intensely good? And then you come up with a short list and you go out and you try to pursue those and try to fulfill those desires and try to do so as often as you possibly can. This is a kind of almost inevitably, in class, we came up with some examples of the desires that feel the best to fulfill. And this is inevitably going to lead to a lifestyle, at least in the short term, of sort of crazy partying, sex and drugs, and recklessness or profligacy, right? Those are the desires that feel the best to fulfill. Of course, they tend to, over time, give way to intense pains as well. And this is why Epicurus tells us a lot of people think that that's the best way to get the most pleasure. When they think hedonism, they think Wolf of Wall Street, right? But in the end, if what we're going for is the most net pleasure, which is total pleasure minus total pain, we have to factor in the pains that are going to result from indulging in those pleasures too. And in the end, the profligate lifestyle is going to be net far more painful than an alternative approach, which is the prudent lifestyle. And this is effectively the one that Epicurus suggests as good hedonists we should pursue. The prudent lifestyle says, yes, we're after pleasure and avoiding pain, but precisely because certain desires give way when fulfilled eventually after the pleasure wears off to intense pains. Precisely for that reason, we should be more careful to think carefully about which desires should I fulfill and which ones should I fulfill often, which ones should I fill only occasionally, and are there desires that it would be better off for me, even if it felt good in the moment, to never actually pursue. And that process of kind of planning your life in a more long-term way, using your reason, is the prudent lifestyle. Epicurus recommends the prudent lifestyle not just for like aesthetic reasons. He's not a prude, even though it's called prudence, this virtue. He actually doesn't even think prudence is valuable for its own sake. The only reason he recommends that we take this more thoughtful and reflective approach is because he thinks in the end it gets us more pleasure than the Wolf of Wall Street lifestyle. Because you get addicted to drugs, or you get addicted to power or fame or sex for that matter, right? Those things have this addictive quality such that fulfilling them feels intensely good, but then once that pleasure disappears, you start to get a craving. And that craving is often hard to fulfill again. And the craving, in the absence of its fulfillment, feels deeply painful. And you see in the film, you see what happens to the guy in the end. The lifestyle that had an intense burst of pleasure was replaced by one that was extremely painful. And in the end, probably his life is overall in the negative on net pleasure. Here's how Epicurus puts this point. And since pleasure is the first good and natural to us, for that very reason, we do not choose every pleasure, but sometimes we pass over many pleasures when greater discomfort accrues to us as the result of them. And similarly, we think many pains better than pleasures. since a greater pleasure comes to us when we have endured pains for a long time. So the profligate lifestyle is just about fulfilling the desires that give you intense, immediate pleasure. The profligate would never, ever spend hours at the gym, for example, because that's really painful. No one wants to feel the pain of going to the gym, especially not at first. Maybe eventually it starts to have its own kind of pleasure. But at least at first, it's very painful to go for a run, to go to the gym, for that matter, to eat healthy, right? But Epicurus's point is that because what we care about is pleasure, precisely for that reason, it sometimes is worth it in the end to suffer through certain pains. And we actually should choose those pains for the sake of getting the pleasure that comes from them. So we choose to suffer through the pain of going to the gym because the pleasure of having a healthy body at the end is worth it. Or the pleasure of having more energy and being slimmer is worth the pain, say, of eating salads instead of chocolate cake, right? Epicurus's thought is sometimes pains are worth choosing for the sake of more pleasure, and some pleasures ought to be completely avoided, like drugs. Very pleasurable, but in the end, the addiction is much more painful because you can't continue fulfilling that forever. You build up a tolerance. I don't know, it's expensive, right? You can't get the drug that you need, and then you start craving it and feeling pain. Epicurus says, for it is not continuous drinkings and revelings, nor satisfaction of lusts, nor the enjoyment of fish and other luxuries of the wealthy table, which produce a pleasant life, but sober reasoning, searching out the motives for all choice and avoidance, and banishing mere opinions, to which are due the greatest disturbance of the soul. So Epicurus's thought is that we should start our planning of our lives as hedonists with sober reasoning. Well, what are we reasoning about? The first thing he thinks we should do is effectively categorize our desires. And the categories that are important for him are these. There's a distinction he draws between natural desires. These are the ones that are kind of hardwired into us as human beings. These are desires for food, for shelter, and we'll get a little more specific about the different kinds of natural desires in a second. But these are desires we have to fulfill, and we all come kind of pre-programmed with. And then vain desires. And these are desires that are not hardwired into us. These are desires that we can get rid of if we want to and we think it's worth it. So among the natural desires, he says, some are both natural and they're hardwired into us, and they're necessary in the sense that you have to fulfill them in order for you to continue living, in order for your body to be healthy, or for you to be happy, in his sense of hedonistic happiness. Natural and necessary desires, you both are, in virtue of being human, you're going to have these, and you have to fulfill them sometimes. So, for example, the desire for a basic amount of food that's relatively nutritious, that's going to be a natural and necessary desire. The desire, the very, bodily desire for water, for hydration, like thirst, that one's got to be satisfied or you're going to die. For health, some basic amount of medical care, you might think, natural and necessary for your body to be repaired to the extent possible when you're facing health issues. And then happiness, you're going to need some minimal amount of rationality and thoughtfulness. And that's going to be necessary for you to achieve happiness. Among natural desires, we've got the necessary and natural, and then we've got the unnecessary and natural. Unnecessary and natural desires are those that are hardwired into us, but we don't actually need to fulfill them in order to just live and be healthy or even for happiness. So you can think of one interpretation of Epicurus is you can think of the natural and unnecessary desires as kind of more elaborate or more specific forms of the natural and necessary desires. So these are, for example, we don't just want like plain white rice with a tiny bit of sodium on it, just enough for our basic nutritional needs. We also crave sometimes a really fancy meal. We really crave, I don't, but I'm told that some people crave caviar, for example, as a fancy food. Epicurus doesn't think that everyone craves any specific exquisite food. Some people might crave caviar. I might crave a steak, right? But everyone has, just in virtue of being human, a desire not just for the bare minimum, but also, a desire for some amount of extravagance in your food. However, Epicurus thinks the natural and unnecessary desires are, one, they're often much harder to fulfill than the natural and necessary. Depending on your resources, they may be easier. But often, you can't go out to eat at a fancy restaurant more than every once in a while, maybe not at all. And they're also a little more dangerous, those desires, in that if you get used to the fancier foods, you're going to find yourself wanting the fancier foods more often. And the bare minimum is not going to satisfy you anymore. And if you don't have the resources to have the fancy foods very often, it's going to lead to financial trouble. Fancier foods often are not as good for you, especially these days. Any restaurant, it's just everything is saturated in butter. And so if you indulge too frequently, that can be detrimental to your health. Epicurus doesn't tell us necessarily that we should eliminate all of our unnecessary natural desires. He does think, though, that both because they're a little more dangerous in their addictive qualities and because they're harder to fulfill, we should be really careful with how frequently we indulge in them. We could, in principle, not indulge in them at all, and it would be okay. The ones we have to fulfill are, fortunately, the ones that are both easiest to fulfill and the least addictive, natural and necessary. We don't find ourselves with a drug-like craving for just water, for example. We do have a craving for it, but it's not something that is an addictive kind of craving. Vain desires, on the other hand, are ones that are the hardest to fulfill, and some of them are impossible to fulfill. And what this means is that by necessity, if you have a vain desire, it will always go unfulfilled. And that is always going to be painful. For this reason, Epicurus thinks vain desires, get rid of them root and branch. Eliminate them. Once you eliminate them, they won't be causing you pain anymore. The fact that they're unfulfilled won't bother you because you don't have the desire, right? So there are sort of broadly two ways to get pleasure from a desire you have. One is to fulfill it, and the other is to just eliminate it. And the choice about which ones should I fulfill and which ones should I eliminate is the process of planning one's life and determining which desires are worth it in the end. All of that is part of the prudent lifestyle that requires doing a bit of Epicurean philosophy. So the further down our chart we go here, the harder they are to fulfill, and the more likely Epicurus is to say, you're better off to just destroy these desires to the extent you can. Now you might be like, well, I feel like I have some vain desires, some ones that just cause trouble for me that I've never been able to fulfill. How do I eliminate them? It's one thing to say that, but another thing to actually, go through a therapeutic process of getting rid of desires. How am I supposed to do that? Epicurus thinks, again, reason comes into play here. He thinks that many of our vain desires, the reason we have them is because of false assumptions, and often irrational assumptions, in the intellect. And that once we see that the assumptions that we're making are false or irrational, we then are better able to rein in the desires that result from those irrational assumptions, and perhaps do away with the desires entirely. The way we determine whether the assumptions we're making about the world and what's good for us are irrational or not is through argument. So here's an example. The one we discussed in class was our desire to escape death, right? He says, become accustomed to the belief that death is nothing to us. For all good and evil consists in sensation, but death is deprivation of sensation. And therefore, a right understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable, not because it adds to it an infinite span of time, but because it takes away the craving for immortality. He says, so death, the most terrifying of ills, is nothing to us, since so long as we exist, death is not with us, but when death comes, then we do not exist. It does not then concern either the living or the dead, since for the former it is not, and the latter are,